here we are, live. And all right. So what I'd like to do is, okay, we have a lot of participants joining. So I think let's give a couple of minutes to the participants who are joining at the moment. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, and wherever you are in whichever part of the world, welcome all to our next series of Expert Facts. I would just like to take a moment to introduce these events that we have created and we've started, as well as our speaker. Expert Facts was actually created to educate people and create an awareness in combating different kinds of crimes, whether it's compliance, financial crime compliance, or cybercrime. PROTEQme focuses on combating cybercrime. And today, we are delighted to introduce and welcome our speaker, Mr. Greg Foss. Greg is a senior security strategist with VMware. Greg focuses on large-scale security research, threat intelligence, and strategic product development. In previous roles, he has also led a threat research team, built and ran a global security operations program, consulted in penetration testing, and has worked as a security analyst for the federal government. Greg is a very active member of the Denver information security community who loves to give back and support the industry. With this, I'm very, very delighted to welcome Greg to our Expert Facts series, who's going to take us through the threats of cybersecurity that happens today in the world, whether it's for individuals or for corporates. And he's also going to share, given his experience, the tips that will help us, all of us, to combat cybercrime. Welcome, Greg, to the Expert Facts series, and over to you for an enlightening, delighting session.
Thank you so much, Firuzi, and thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to PROTEQme for hosting this event. So really appreciate you all joining us tonight, and look forward to talking with you all about a topic that we've been digging into a lot within my team over at VMware Carbon Black around e-crime industrialization, and essentially how we've seen these cybercrime groups really evolve into full-on large-scale businesses. And so to highlight this, I want to start with just talking about a threat that we all are probably very familiar with, unfortunately, and that's ransomware. And this is one that I think is so unbelievably damaging, now looking at the destructive nature of these ransomware attacks, and especially the prevalence of these attacks. Just since the beginning of 2019, compared to data that we've collected last year, we've seen a 900% increase in just the scale of these attacks and the number of ransomware infections. So, a significant jump from the years prior. And not only are we seeing this more and more commonly, but we're actually getting more and more sophisticated attacks that are leveraging ransomware as kind of their final payloads. So now to kind of help us figure out, what you all have seen on your side in terms of ransomware attacks, we do have a poll question related to essentially ransomware attacks, and we want to see, kind of what you all think. So you should see this popping up. There we go. So essentially, we're asking, how often do you deal with malware infections on your network? So definitely feel free to answer here and let us know what your thoughts are.
Okay, so thank you, Greg, for that. I think we've got answers coming in. Mostly, I think people are have gone for monthly, weekly, or not at all. So 50% of people have said not at all. Okay, so dynamics are changing. Okay, so
All
it's gone
right.
weekly, monthly.
Yeah,
So
not at all. You guys are lucky. This is great.
yeah, so I think it's 10% daily, approximately 10% weekly, approximately 30% monthly. Um, All right. And about 50% people haven't probably gone through it, or either they're not aware of it, either of it.
Oh, very cool. Very interesting stats. I mean, and that's the thing, like even for some of these companies that are dealing with this daily, hopefully that's something that's being prevented, that you're able to stop, within your environment. Maybe you're just observing this activity. And for those that have said not at all, I'm wondering, is this something where you aren't seeing this activity and maybe don't have the tooling to detect this within the environment? So there's kind of those two extremes there. And there's a lot of reasons that that could be the case.
Yes. So
All
just
right.
a little bit about malware. I think when I was talking to somebody some time ago, there's a little bit of an ignorance here in the Middle East part of our world. So maybe Greg, as you take along, as you take the session along, perhaps we can actually relate to the audience as to what they should be looking out for.
For sure, for sure. And we'll get into that into some next slides. So I think, do we just stop? Oh, there we go. Oh, cool. Looks like we can share the results too.
Yes.
Um, should we do that?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the results. I think if every
Oh, there we go. Oh, okay. And then we'll kill it there. Okay, perfect. So diving into this from our data, in terms of industry verticals that we saw ransomware targeting, specifically was focused on energy and utilities. And the big concerning aspect with that is energy and utilities is essentially, what controls all of these kind of core components to our daily lives. Looking at electricity, gas, all of these kind of utilities that are core components to what we do in the physical world are being significantly targeted by ransomware. Now, that's pretty significantly damaging. And right after that, the next most commonly targeted industry vertical is government organizations. And now we've seen a significant uptick in this leading up to the election within the United States, which is definitely concerning for us in lots of ways. But this is something where we're real interested to see how these stats change when we run these checks again at the end of this year. So this is all 2019 what we're looking at here, but in general just gives you kind of an idea of who some of these main primary targets are for these different groups.
So Greg, there's a question. Would you like to take the questions as and when we go along, or would you like to answer them at the end?
Yeah, for sure. I'd be glad to take questions as they
All
come up.
right. So somebody is asked saying, sir, have good question. Does it depend on how many computer virus spends through our firewall? I set my firewall on and prevent any unknown sender send me. Will it come back? So
Yeah,
it's a,
so yeah,
yes,
it
go ahead.
really depends. I mean, like the more computer systems you have, the larger attack surface you have. So it definitely does impact, the ability for these actors to get into the environment. It gives them more systems to possibly go after. It gives them more targets to affect with their ransomware payloads as well. So all of that plays into this. But really, the key is going to be looking at how you're protecting those systems and what you have in terms of that outer perimeter. So like that firewall, as he mentioned, is going to be a key component of protecting that environment, keep creating kind of the outer shell where you can view and block kind of data coming in and out of the environment. And to highlight this, we actually have kind of a walkthrough they like to go through that really highlights just what attackers see when they are targeting your organization. And we took this standpoint because it helps highlight, this is the way you're probably going to be targeted and the way we're mostly seeing these groups target organizations. So we wanted to break it down from this angle. So over here, we're looking at a corporation that is largely what we call in the industry a black box at this time. They don't know anything about the network. They don't know about what you're running. They just know this company exists. So what they're first going to do, our little bad guy over here, our happy hacker, they're going to start doing open source intelligence gathering on the organization. Now, this is going to be looking at your social media profiles, your geography, your public websites, all of your publicly exposed IP addresses, your employee directories, all of that kind of information that's going to play into how they can further figure out how they're going to target and attack the organization. Now, next, it leads into reconnaissance, or essentially actively scanning the organization from the perimeter. From here, they're going to stand up their own infrastructure and they're going to start scanning and figure out, what your attack surface looks like for them. What are some available targets that they might be able to go after? And what we're looking at here is essentially going to be your public footprint. So anything that's like web servers, maybe a remote desktop server, maybe your VPN concentrators, all of these things that you have to have exposed to the internet so that you can do business. And every organization has these kind of systems. So every organization is essentially vulnerable in some way to these types of attacks.
So I have a quick question over here from the audience. Sorry about that. On your previous
Oh
slide,
no.
the person's asking, why do you ask why these ransomware target these types of sectors? Why do the ransomware attackers target these type of sectors, and by what means?
Yeah, yeah. So essentially, why they target them is twofold. It really depends on their goals. What is going to be the output of this, what they think their most largest return on investment is, but also it's going to be ease and ease of access into the corporation. So what's going to be the softest, easiest target? And a lot of manufacturing, utilities, these kind of companies have very old systems because of the infrastructures that they operate on. So, just statistically speaking, a lot of these types of organizations, it's difficult for them to patch. It's difficult for them to upgrade this equipment. So therefore, they just become a more opportunistic target. Now, when you look at the government targeting, that is definitely more focused and with the end goal of either espionage or otherwise, causing chaos or damage, what have you. But essentially, I would say those are kind of the two primary mechanisms. But in terms of means, like how they attack, we're actually going to walk through that right now. So, how we're talking about reconnaissance, building that understanding of the organization from the outside, they can take that information and now make an educated guess about what is on the inside of the organization. Typically you're going to be running the same type of systems here as you might have internally, in addition to appliances and whatnot. And now additionally, we have the, outsiders here, the users that are sitting on their home networks, essentially. So they're definitely different types of targets. And so what they're going to do at this phase is essentially start passively monitoring the organization. And what that means is they're going to look for any systems that may have potential to be vulnerable in the future. They don't have to necessarily have a vulnerability right now. The whole thing with attackers is they have all the time in the world, and this is their job. This is their job to break into these organizations and to penetrate these networks. So what they'll do is passively monitor, say, your VPN appliances, and if there is a new vulnerability that is released for these appliances, they will go after those at that point. Especially, there's a public exploit released. Now that opens this up as a target, whereas it wouldn't have been before. And most organizations have patch windows. Even if you have a very good patch cycle that's like 30 days or something to that effect, you could still be very vulnerable to this type of attack. So essentially, they'll be monitoring here. And this is something we've seen recently with VPNs, such as Pulse VPN, being targeted by a significant number of ransomware groups in this same fashion. The other avenue would be to go after these home users, so maybe they're starting to craft their attack, figure out how they're going to come after the organization. They may decide to send a phishing email, or what we've seen in terms of the darknet markets and some of the chatter is looking for home router exploits. So they're going to target these users in their home networks as a means of gaining access to this asset and then leverage their access to gain access back into the organization. Now, the primary means, most common, is going to be remote desktop protocol. So seeing them target the organization with remote desktop protocol, that is the number one way we see all of these groups get in. It's gaining access through RDP and just using credentials that they've either lifted from other breaches or have been able to pilfer from other sales on the dark web and leverage that information to gain access to the organization.
Greg, there's a quick question. I think there's some clarification required on reconnaissance. So somebody is asking, I think that information gathering is a part of reconnaissance itself, isn't it?
Correct. Yeah, yeah. So I was kind of just trying to break it down in more detail because that is all part of reconnaissance, like open source intel gathering, scanning, all of that is going to be part of the reconnaissance stage. So I was taking it more as like breaking it down into passive reconnaissance, which is going to be that open source side, and then active reconnaissance, which is going to be actually touching these hosts directly.
Right. There is one more question.
Oh yeah.
Apparently, he's asking they use some software and script to trick the system to give the system something about good questions, to make them unaware of something on good questions. Why wireless network like mine able to hack easily when I add too much security? You can answer mine at the end or something to that effect. So somebody's, I think, talking more about the wireless network. I think, being susceptible to attacks, which I think you can probably take on later. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, wireless network, like if you have these connected to the internet and have them remotely accessible, that is going to be a means for them to attack your home network directly in that way. Now, if you're a large scale target, like say someone in politics or someone who's, very wealthy, then, someone will take the time possibly to go to your properties and directly try and break into these wireless networks. We've seen this multiple times, but it really depends on the configurations at that point. So they're exactly right. Like a lot of that is, you have to make yourself vulnerable by exposing that to the internet to be susceptible to a lot of these exploits. But on the other hand, if someone's physically located near their target, they're definitely going to drive over there and, try and launch some of these attacks directly. Um, but essentially, one of the things, like getting back to looking at the enterprise that they're attacking here, once they break into this server, say they compromise this Windows server through remote desktop protocol, they're going to have a implant that's going to call back to a separate server than the one that they did the initial scanning from. They do this because you most likely know about this server already. It's probably in your logs, probably already being tracked. But they want to have this one as a new box for them to catch the shell so that they can gain this persistent access to your organization. Now, once they have that access, they're going to begin their initial reconnaissance inside the organization and start mapping out these other assets to really understand what you have within the organization and how they can continue to target and escalate their attack. Now, the next thing they need to do that is they need credentials. There's multiple ways they could gather these credentials. These might already be in memory on this box right here. Some admin has logged in maybe and used some credentials that are connected to the domain at that point. Or, they might have to trick someone. They might have to figure out how they can pivot. There's a lot of different ways that they could steal those credentials. But either way, their first step is usually going to be elevate those privileges and steal credentials so that they can begin to move laterally in the organization. Now, the next thing they're going to do once they have those creds is start testing them and figure out what they can access. Now, a lot of times, if you see this failed authentication coming from an internet-facing server, that's going to be a dead giveaway that something is up, and you need to look into this activity right away. Even if this authentication is successful, why is anyone logging in from an internet-facing server into the internal workings of your organization? That is something to definitely use as a flag to trigger on and begin to look into. Now, eventually, they are going to get this right. They are going to get some good credentials and they are going to begin to pivot. With that, they're going to move laterally and continue to implant themselves within the organization. And as part of that, they're going to identify key prominent resources, such as right here, we have the backups. Now, depending on how the organization does this, there's a lot of really great solutions for this now. But there's also a lot of organizations that simply just store these off on another Windows box or use SQL databases or what have you. The simpler mechanism this is, the easier it's going to be for the attacker to backdoor this system directly. Now, this is something we've seen very commonly with a lot of different ransomware groups, is backdooring of the backup servers themselves, and even more so trying to get their malware implanted within the backups. So, when you do the restorations of systems, they're actually pushing the malware back out. So it's kind of a funny chain of events here. And often this is going to be a different implant than what they're using here. They're going to have this callback to a redundant command and control server. And they do this because they want to make sure they leave that foot in the door, kind of propping that door open. So if you do find out about this, you're able to uncover this other activity, they still have a chance at maintaining this other beacon over here. And they're going to have this call back very slowly. This will be like maybe once a day, once a week, once a month, or sometimes even longer, often at odd periods of the day, mainly to just maintain this access and make sure that they can get back into the organization should you uncover them through other means and cut their access off through any other mechanism.
So,
Now
Greg,
oh yeah.
sorry to interrupt. I think there's a very nice comment from one of our participants called Vinod, and he said, if I can add one thing, and if it's possible for me to kind of interrupt, for credentials, the worst thing is that people do not change their credentials often, the default is credentials.
Oh yeah.
So, do you have something to say about that?
Yes, definitely. That is a major problem. I'd say it's one of the biggest problems that leads to a lot of these breaches. And we actually have some slides later on down the line that cover that topic specifically. So that's a great comment, and I completely agree. I mean, that's one of those things, like it's a simple control. If more people could do this effectively, we wouldn't have nearly as many of these types of problems. So yeah, very true.
Another,
So,
sorry to
oh
interrupt.
yeah.
It somebody's asked how easy is it to find vulnerabilities in VPN endpoints?
Oh, I mean, yeah, it depends on which angle you're looking at it as, right? Like if you're doing exploit development and you're actually trying to fuzz the appliance and find these vulnerabilities yourself, that is incredibly difficult. That is a very high skill level required. There's not many people that know how to do that type of thing. So creating those exploits in the first place is definitely very difficult. But what we're talking about here is this is like someone has already found this vulnerability and is probably publicly disclosed, probably legitimately through common vulnerabilities and exposures and things like that. So there's probably like a CVE score to it. And at this point, you know, the organization has actually released a patch for it. So we're not even talking about 0 days at this point. We're talking about N days, where you have like say 30 days to patch this vulnerability. And as long as this is out there and someone is able to develop an exploit for this using the POC that's maybe been released, or if there's a full exploit already out there, they're just going to take advantage of that. So I think there's two things we're kind of talking about. Like the exploit researchers are usually more on the good side, trying to prevent these sort of things by doing that proactive fuzzing and development of exploits. Whereas there's also bad guys that do this as well, but I would say it's not as prevalent as people would think. Most of this is just opportunistic. So these guys see like this new exploit come out, and then they're just like, oh, I have this company I've been monitoring that uses that technology. I'm going to leverage that to break into their organization now. So that's kind of more how this process sort of works for them.
All right. Thank you so much, Greg.
No, no, for sure. So the main thing here that they need to get to for these groups to be extremely successful is your most sensitive data. And so that essentially, I just put a little file share here, but essentially, I mean, this could be all over the organization, could be stored in multiple different facets. But essentially what their end goal is going to be is to gain access to this sensitive data and then figure out how they're going to move this out of the environment. Now, there's a ton of different ways that actors will leverage to do this. Most of them are actually very brazen, like they don't care. They'll just straight upload over FTP to another server, which over here is their other compromised asset. Most of these groups leverage existing compromised infrastructure. So a lot of this could be like a web server that has already been compromised, and now they just have a folder there where they're going to upload data to, and then quickly move it off to whatever their command and control infrastructure is. But one way we've actually seen these groups leverage to get these data sets out of environments is by installing things like OwnCloud, which all that does is basically sync, it creates like a folder where you can just drop contents in, and this will sync those contents to their own cloud installation. You know, very much the same as like Dropbox or Google Drive or other types of kind of cloud sharing solutions. So I mean, there's tons of different ways, but really at the end of the day, for them to take this data out of your environment, it has to cross a boundary of some kind. So you want to make sure you have that visibility in there to see this data leaving, regardless of by what means they decide to migrate it out of the environment. Now, another way they will try and do this is by leveraging DNS. Now, DNS is much stealthier, though if you're logging DNS, this should be something that's pretty obvious to see happening in the environment, because they're going to basically take a single server within your organization, and you're going to see these, you know, tons of different requests going out to a single parent domain with lots of varying subdomains over a long period of time. And so that's definitely something to watch for. And, you know, if you break all that down, you can actually see the amount of data being exfiltrated from the environment. But either way, they're going to figure out how to move this out of your environment. And then, you know, at this point, if they do get these files out of your environment, it's kind of already game over, because the attacker can profit from this in any number of ways. they can basically take this to their marketplace. They might use public marketplaces like hacker forums and e-crime groups and what have you. Or a lot of these groups now just run their own infrastructures and run their own e-crime operations. So essentially, once this data has been exfiltrated, it's already game over for the organization, even before they begin to encrypt the organization. Because at this point, they've stolen your most sensitive data. They understand everything about your company. They probably have all your employee records, all your employees' credentials, all that good stuff. And at this point is when you might actually catch on to what's happening and see, that your data has been exfiltrated and the environment is now encrypted. And so here we have our customer or our victim who's now realized what's happened, and they're freaked out. So they have to figure out how to communicate with the attacker to get their data back. So they're going to communicate over Tor and basically come to an agreement. And assuming this is a standard ransomware, it's not like anything crazy or one of these where they don't know what's going on. Essentially, they can give you the keys once you've paid them and negotiated with them and decrypt your environment. Now, at this point, a lot of people think like, okay, we're good now. The ransomware has been taken care of. We're in a lot better state. But the problem is, a lot of people don't take into account this persistence mechanism that's built into a lot of ransomware payloads directly, and also the persistence mechanisms that may have been leveraged by the attacker as they've been manually migrating through the environment. And now, not only do they have their initial kind of backups that might not have been discovered during this recovery phase, they also have different users within the environment that could still be compromised, in addition to various other servers that could still be compromised. So this attacker, even though you paid the ransom and quote unquote recovered from the incident, they could still very much have access back into the organization through a lot of different means. And they're going to continue to profit in a lot of different ways.
So, Greg, my understanding as a cybersecurity expert is that a lot of organizations feel that once the organization has been infiltrated and they've gotten rid of the hackers, they're good to go. But my understanding is that they never really get out of your system or your organization, and the re-hacking happens because they've always been in your system. So it's very difficult to get them out. What is your view on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, one of my friends at the FBI always likes to say, the most common victim of a burglary is going to be the house that just had a burglary, and the same concept applies to the e-crime space, because there's so many more avenues for them to profit from these breaches. And to kind of go along with that, I think we might have a poll question to get some of the audience's feedback in this regard as well.
Awesome. So we've launched the next poll question, and the question is: have you experienced a successful ransomware attack against your organization this year? We know, so 100%
That's
people said
good. That's
no.
good.
So
Nice.
I just wanted to share a quick example. So I know for sure that there are a couple of companies that I've come across, and one such company where the CEO was obviously probably not very much in touch with the CFO. And the CFO kind of received a mail close to midnight saying he was in the middle of a discussion, an acquisition or a merger and acquisition discussion, and he wanted the CFO to transfer $150,000, no questions asked. And apparently, I don't know what the audience think, but the CFO, I always ask this question: what do you think he did? Did he transfer or did he not? And he actually did.
Yeah.
So a lot of
It's
these don't
scary, right?
get published.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the thing with these attacks, and people always want to take it out on the victims of these, but like when you take a step back and look at this person, like they could have gotten a fake email from the CEO forcing them to perform this transaction, and maybe they don't talk to them ever, and so like it puts them in this weird kind of uncomfortable space. And that's exactly what attackers want to exploit, is those weaknesses in human emotion and our just general connectedness with other people. They exploit that, and it's unfortunate, but it's something to be aware of and try and put some of those controls in place, like for that organization to say, if something like this comes through, make sure you verify it through X process. And unfortunately, a lot of those processes are not created until something catastrophic happens to the organization. So it's definitely unfortunate.
Sorry, there's been a change in the numbers. So obviously, 11% of people now say that they have been going through that attack, and the numbers have dropped,
Mhm.
saying yes, about 89%. There's another question over here which says that also if we pay them the ransom amount, then there's no guarantee that they don't have a copy of our data and that they can still
Correct.
sell our data, to unknown bodies. So I think
Yeah,
we're going to
yeah.
talk
And
about it later, right?
oh, yeah, yeah. And I would make the assumption, I would take it a step further to always assume that they do have your data, whether or not they choose to use that in extortion or not. They will have stolen all your credentials. They will have stolen credentials from your users' browsers. I mean, there's all sorts of things they will have to steal for the operation to be successful. So, I mean, you always have to go through and do a full clean sweep after these, even if they aren't doing the double extortion, even if it's just regular ransomware. Assume that they have stolen a significant amount of your data that could come up at some point in the future.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
awesome. No, for sure. Let's hop into some of what we've seen across various ransomware families. One of the things I wanted to highlight here is persistence within ransomware payloads themselves. So this is just looking at the malware itself, just the ransomware payloads. And over here, what the red dots are the MITRE TIDs, so the techniques. And then these are the different ransomware groups that share overlapping techniques with each other. And a majority of these are centered around rootkit mechanisms, such as modifying the master boot record. A lot of these will automatically create scheduled tasks. They will modify registry run keys, create startup folder items, and a majority of all ransomware will leverage hidden files and directories just simply as a means to execute their attacks. So it's something that is very consistent among ransomware today, is leveraging persistence to make sure that they maintain this access into organizations. And now the next kind of one I wanted to highlight here is credential access. Almost all ransomware payloads will steal credentials from various places across the organization. And most prominently, it's going to be anything stored within the browser. So if you're using like Chrome, Firefox, stuff like that, do not store your creds in the browser because this is a prime target for them. And it's very easy to pull these credentials out. And not just credentials, but they take cookies as well. So if you have existing sessions with sites that can be leveraged, they will definitely be leveraging that in future attacks, as well as targeting your employees, your customers, and what have you directly. So definitely take a look at locking down those credentials and files and or in your browsers, and make sure people aren't storing those credentials there. In other things that you see on target is like Telegram, various chat programs, maybe if you have FTP servers, SCP, like any SSH keys, they'll pull all of that in addition to just running general clipboard monitoring and keystroke logging. Now, the last piece that I want to highlight in here is just the collection aspect. A lot of ransomware, talking about how you should assume that ransomware, these groups have stolen data. Just about every time they will have stolen data, and not even just manually. A lot of this is just part of their automated payloads, is taking this data, packaging it up, and exfiltrating it from the environment. So, taking anything from the local system, that automated collection, and a lot of this is centered around stealing those credentials, because those credentials go a long way. And we'll talk about those more when we get to the kind of e-crime ecosystem of sorts. But really, we took everything we saw from 2019 in terms of ransomware attacks and broke this down along the MITRE attack framework. And what was interesting here, in terms of the ones that we didn't highlight before, most people commonly just associate ransomware with this impact section, that data encryption, inhibiting system recovery, all of those types of things. But really, there's a lot more going on with these malware payloads than people give ransomware groups credit for. When you're looking at defense evasion, this is a core component for us being an endpoint security company, because that defense evasion is going to be a key component for how they evade our technical controls. This is a key component for them to bypass endpoint security, bypass your network security, and maintain this access in the organization long enough for them to both steal data and execute their payloads. A lot of them do this automated discovery as well. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just wanted to highlight, how active some of these malware payloads are and the breadth at which they can operate. And so, dive. Oh yeah.
Sorry, great. Quick one. So somebody is asking, can they crack the mainframe if it was too powerful like Facebook?
Ooh, I don't know about that one. So, I mean, like, it depends, right? Like, any company can be breached. I wouldn't say Facebook is any better or worse than anyone else. It just comes down to that opportunistic targeting. I mean, like Facebook, say if I wanted to target Facebook, I would just simply try and pay someone off inside there. Like every company has their weak points, and most of these weak points are going to be an individual, not even a technical control. So it really depends on the actor who's going after them, what their means are, and kind of what their end goals are. But at the end of the day, there's always a way, which leads into why this underground economy has grown so exponentially, especially in 2020. I mean, this is something that's been staggering to me to watch, just coming from just simply what we saw, 2018, 2019, like 2020. Now we're seeing a significant shift of groups that maybe weren't necessarily technical crime groups, were more just kind of into traditional crime, if you will. But essentially now they're being forced to shift their operations to online because of the coronavirus. In the same way, a lot of businesses have been forced to go online. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy of things happening that have forced all of this to come to a culmination of where we are now. And so what that leads into is the extortion angle that we're seeing these ransomware groups take. We've touched on this a bit in some of the other slides, but really what this came down to was companies were getting too good at figuring out how to restore from backups and basically avoiding paying the ransoms to these groups. Technology had just advanced to a point where people could get hit with ransom and be like, okay, we're just going to restore, our backups are solid, we're using like Commvault and stuff like that. So they have all these solutions now that make it very easy for organizations to recover. So these groups had to adapt and they had to evolve and they had to add double extortion onto the plate in order to continue making money. And so that involves this more manual aspect of them going through these companies and manually pilfering data from the organization. And what they do with this data is they run a lot of these dark web kind of websites. Some of them actually operate on the ClearNet and some are on I2P. But really, they run these sites where they host the stolen information that they've pilfered from these organizations. One of the groups here, PISA, is short for Protect Your System, Amigo. They got like a little sombrero and mustache guy here. So some of them are pretty creative and funny. But I wanted to highlight some of these groups to give you an idea of kind of what they actually do with this data when they steal it. So the first group I want to touch on is the Maze cartel. Maze is one of the most prolific and most prominent ransomware groups of our time. They are purported to be a very massive group, estimated to be over 100 plus members. And that's why they call themselves a cartel. They also are tied into various other groups. And Maze is the group that kind of initially, or is at least credited with initially coming up with the double extortion kind of techniques. So they were the first group to go and start just saying, hey, we stole all your data. So even if you don't pay the ransom, we're going to go sell your data, or you have to pay us to get your data taken down. So they run a website called Maze News, where they actually post all of this stolen data. So over here's a bunch of clients, over here's full dumps of all clients. And they just talk about kind of what they've stolen, how they've stolen it, and they give like daily blog updates. They have a news feed. They're extremely active. Just about every day, they're dumping new information on new companies that they've compromised. So very skilled, very prominent attackers that are very capable. And this is just a subset of their dumps. I believe this is like in less than a week, all of this was published. This is like one of their blog posts. And their website is very public. They're very brazen about what they do. So you can go read about this right now. They don't really care at all about who knows about them or what they're doing. I mean, they post their own news. So they're very prominent, and they're definitely a group to not take take lightly. They're very skilled and very dangerous kind of group. And part of that is they're starting to partner with other groups that are also very powerful. The Ragnar Locker group has recently joined an alliance with the Maze cartel. And we've actually seen a culmination of their combined efforts recently. Ragnar Locker, one of their most famous kind of techniques is leveraging a full virtual machine to deploy that to the system and then have their ransomware payloads be executed from within that. I want to say like a week or two ago, we actually saw this happen where the VM was deployed and then they leveraged Maze ransomware in the attack. So these groups have publicly stated that they have joined forces and they're actively looking to join forces with various other groups as well, which just makes them all the more powerful, all the more capable. They have shared infrastructure. They now can share all of the stolen data that they've collected, which includes credentials. As we're talking about credential reuse being a significant problem, that's why they go after the browsers. That's why they dump your whole Active Directory. They're going to take all of this content offline. They're going to crack what they need to. They're going to take cookies. They're going to gain access to stuff. I mean, this goes a lot further than just the corporations they're breaking into. They can get into personal bank accounts. They can get into your personal email. They can get into all these other assets just due to these corporations they're breaking into. And this data that they can leverage from these corporations can be used to target partners and related organizations to each of these companies. Now, there's a ton of these different groups, so I won't spend too much time on them. But so Nephilim, another double extortion group, they run a site called Corporate Leaks, and down here they kind of post information on their victims. R Evil, or otherwise known as Soda no Kibi, runs a website called the Happy Blog, which is pretty ironic. But one thing I found interesting here is they actually like to detail some of their attack techniques and what they've done to get this data. So here they actually talk about for over a month, the structure of the corporation's work, user services, and cloud data storage were examined. And 1 terabyte of confidential data was copied as a result. So, you get an idea of like, this is someone manually mapping out this organization, sitting in there, looking at everything that's going on, figuring out what to steal, and then exfiltrating this data. This is a definitely more advanced adversary. This isn't just someone dropping a malicious macro document and it having, going out and running the payloads for them. They're spending a lot of time and effort to manually gather this data and collect it and make it available for posting. Now, PISA, the group we were talking about earlier, they also go by Mespinoza. But essentially, they run a pretty creative site. I actually like their site. It looks like an old Commodore 64 kind of terminal, and it like loads when you bring it up. So it's like pretty fancy. And they have a pretty good sense of humor, honestly. Like they refer to their victims as their partners, and they give like little advertisements about their businesses and stuff. So, still criminals, but kind of funny with the way they go about it. Clop, another prominent ransomware group. And what's interesting here, and that I wanted to call out specifically with them, is that they have actually mentioned that they have never attacked hospitals, orphanages, nursing homes, charitable foundations, and those are targets that they will not go after. So I mean, that's nice. There are many ransomware groups that have actually made statements like this. The thing is, they still do go after healthcare in some respects. They go after the data brokers, the companies that manage all this data for various hospital networks. And there are groups that have simply said they are going to continue to target hospitals, as we saw about a week ago with Ryuk possibly being behind the attack against the major hospital network here in the United States. I mean, there's a lot of these groups that just don't care. And that one specifically has already resulted in death and various other significant impacts to people. So, as light as some of these groups will make of it, there's definitely other groups that don't care at all and are going to target anything with impunity. Doppelpaymer, another prominent group, posting stolen data. This one's kind of interesting. PROTEQme, they're another very public group, and it's actually believed that they've now evolved into Egregore, which is just a different name, but very similar tactics. So they think it's related to Sekhmet. But they, both of those groups run these public leak sites. And what's interesting about Sekhmet is they actually track their views of this data. And so like some of these are like, they have 28,000 views of this stolen data for this organization. So, I mean, you just think about the long-term potential impacts to a business that's hit by some of these attackers. It can be very staggering, can be very significantly impactful. Conti, another relatively kind of newer one. A really neat thing about Conti, this actor or this ransomware was actually discovered by VMware Carbon Black. One of our threat researchers actually was the first to report on this one. So really cool one for us. And what's interesting is at the time, we didn't know they were a double extortion group because at the time they hadn't published anything yet. It was the very first pieces of malware for this group that we come across, but they've since published their website, Conti News, and began to release leaks for their victims. And another prominent one, relatively new, is SunCrypt. Same sort of thing, just posting the stolen data online for organizations that refuse to pay. Now, these are the more prominent ones, and there's still more that I didn't even talk about, but there's also the other side of this, the much smaller actors, the groups that just leverage e-crime forums and hacker forums and things of that nature to post stolen data and things like that. So that's going to prominently be on like XSS or exploit.in or the RAID forums, which is now one of the most prominent hacker forums on the internet due to some stolen data that was published, I want to say a couple of days ago. So real interesting group there. And I think we actually have another poll to tie into kind of some of what we were just talking about here.
Yes. So the next polling question for all our participants is, if you ever experienced a ransomware attack, did the attackers leverage double extortion? So now that you're all aware of what double extortion is all about, I think it's all about applying that knowledge, right? And answering the question. So interesting.
And
Good,
looks
good.
like we have someone who did too. Dang.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So 25%
Couple.
at the moment have experienced it.
Yeah.
30% have experienced ransomware attacks and double extortion. So
Man.
36% have experienced ransomware attack and
Wow.
extortion. So numbers are going higher.
Yeah, this is real interesting because it shows the prominence of this tactic. I mean, just within this group we have here, we have a significant number of folks that have experienced this. So no, that's definitely fascinating. Unfortunate, but fascinating. It's scary. It really highlights the breadth that these groups are capable of reaching. I mean, um, from what we've seen, it's definitely interesting, but like seeing people here talking with us that have directly experienced this as well, it's definitely concerning to say the least. But yeah.
Also, I think, Greg, it reinforces our need to create this awareness for people to secure themselves and combat cybercrime, right? Because I think,
Yeah,
I believe that human being is the weakest element in all of this because they have emotions and easily hackable. So,
correct.
yeah, just from
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like that's the thing. I always hate when people do like their phishing attacks and they're like, oh, I tricked so and so. It's like, yeah, but like any one of us could be tricked if you make the ruse good enough. Like even some people on my team like have fallen for phishing attacks because we like to mess with each other and stuff. And so, I mean, it's something where you know someone well enough, you can trick someone into doing just about anything.
Can I just,
So we're all
sorry, can I
vulnerable.
share something? There was during my cyber awareness trainings with some large corporates, there was an example that was shared by the IT department that one of their staff actually received a phishing mail where he was awarded $20,000 as a reward if he would send them 6,000 dirhams. And he did.
Yeah, of course.
He
Oh
did.
no.
And of course, they came back saying, you're very fast and you're very quick. So, we really want to up your and double your reward to $40,000. Send us
Oh,
6,000 more. And he did. And you won't believe he found out about it, the mail being a phishing attack after he had transferred 36,000 dirhams to the hackers.
whoa,
When he went to the IT
whoa.
guys and he said, guys, I think this is, I'm in trouble. Can you help me get my money back? So I just wanted to share with
Wow.
everybody that, because we are into cyber awareness trainings and a lot of these incidences come to our attention. It's just, you are the next one till it happens to you. Till it doesn't, you just think you're safe, but I just feel that nobody's really safe. And so I think everybody must take precautions in, making themselves aware and protecting themselves, if that
Yeah,
makes.
yeah, no, that's a great point, Fruzy. And I'm glad you mentioned that. Like that's something that's extremely prominent, those types of schemes. And one of the things, like I don't know how it works in Dubai, but in the States, a big reason they use specific dollar amounts is because of the tax and reporting kind of side of things, and plus the limit you can put on a check before it bounces. And so like they use these specific dollar amounts for those reasons. And that's probably why for this scam, they were chunking it out in those 6,000 kind of increments like that, because it helps them to ensure they're actually going to get the money at the end of it. So definitely very interesting. Well, and that's where, all of this comes to a head with all of this data that they've already stolen and how they can leverage this to gain access to additional companies and additional personal accounts that they can leverage to steal additional money. And that gets into credential stuffing. And what that is, taking these large lists of credentials and then trying them across thousands of different services and doing this in as automated of way as possible. Now, another thing we're seeing them do after these attacks is leverage conversation hijacking. And this might even happen and take place before they do the ransomware attack, because they're still in that internal kind of figuring out what their next strategy is. And conversation hacking is where you essentially get into someone's email account and you start looking through old conversations they may have with someone, maybe something that's fallen off, or connections they have at another company that you may want to target, and essentially rekindling those conversations, starting up a new conversation with them, and then sending a payload eventually, such as a macro enabled document or something like that, in order to trick them into running that and then gain access to this other organization using that conversation. Now, internally, with companies that have very good segmentation, like say if my system can't talk to Bob's system at my company, and they need a different way to pivot and move laterally within the organization, they're going to leverage your internal chat programs to do so. So one of the primary ones we've seen is them leveraging Slack. So rekindling these old conversations, same sort of thing, and eventually tricking someone into running a payload through Slack. And one of the groups we've seen most recently, or one of the malwares essentially being leveraged in these attacks most recently, is Emotet. So just something very, very prominent that ties back into this kind of whole criminal ecosystem. Now, looking at some of the tools that are leveraged, we do a lot of work with Digital Shadows, and they do a lot of darknet monitoring. And so one of the things they were looking at is what are the most prominent credential stuffing tools we've seen out there. And one of the most prominent is OpenBullet. But the one I find kind of most interesting is Centrumba, simply because they have this means of using image recognition built into the tool to detect and solve simple CAPTCHAs. And so, allowing them to do automated attacks against various web applications and bypassing those CAPTCHAs automatically without having to pay for a service to do so. And then there's various other ones, but essentially these are essentially commercial grade credential stuffing tools that are available on the dark web. Now, some pictures of these just to show you kind of what they look like. This one's OpenBullet. And all of these plugins are essentially community written plugins. So you can see the authors of these plugins, you can see like where they're hosting it, and what have you. But essentially these are used to just take lists of credentials and try those credentials against various different sites. Down here is Sniper, very similar kind of thing, but this is just more checkboxes. So you check all the services that you want to target. And what's interesting over here is both of these actually allow you to pass the data through proxies. So it helps with that anonymity component and being able to run this without having it directly tied to you, without some work being done on the other end. It also has integration with solving of CAPTCHAs. And then some of these will use Selenium. So they use browser automation to perform some of these attacks. And now looking at some of the services that allow you to automate the solving of CAPTCHAs, there's various solutions out there, which all these do is basically take the CAPTCHA codes that you get from more complex CAPTCHAs, like the Google reCAPTCHA service, and things like that. And it will take those CAPTCHAs and offload them to someone, somewhere else who's signed up to be participating in these services. And they'll essentially go through and solve the CAPTCHA for you and send the key back to you. So you can automate it on your end, and then you just have the human kind of element outsourced. So it makes it very easy for some of these groups to pull off some of these attacks. And then looking at the open source side of things, this is one that's I would actually trust. It's an open source tool, and it's more on Blue Team side to take your existing credentials that you know about and your organizational, say all your organization's emails, and you can go check those and see if there are exposures that exist online. So Credover is a really, really cool tool in that regard, and it just makes it easy to kind of go and check a lot of various sources. Now, what this leads into next is what we call initial access brokers. These are the groups that essentially don't necessarily do the ransomware component or anything like that, but what they will do is essentially initial exploitation of target networks. They will gain access, they will put a foot kind of in the door to prop the door open, and then they will maintain that access and go sell direct access into these companies online. Now, this is something we've seen, over at least the last decade, very prevalent kind of thing, but mostly it used to just be targeting personal home computers. They would go after personal systems, and then they would sell access to these basically as pivot points for people to target their operations through and leverage in, like, say, denial of service operations and things like that. But essentially, it used to be much smaller scale than what we're seeing now, which is initial exploitation of the business in the same way we saw previously, maybe through remote desktop, maybe through Pulse VPN, anything like that, phishing attack, what have you, gaining that initial access and then mapping out the organization from inside and then placing a dollar value on that and then posting that access for sale on the dark web. Now, a lot of these go for relatively cheap. Like, you can buy access to these for some of them a couple $100s if it's, say, a small company. But then some of the other organizations, like if it's a government institution, it's maybe a very prominent organization, maybe located somewhere specifically. These can go anywhere from $500,000 plus. And what's most concerning to us about this trend is that it just simply lowers the bar to entry and makes it so a lot of people that maybe wouldn't have had the skills to perform some of these attacks in the past can definitely easily do this now with minimal skill. They just have to have the right amount of cryptocurrency and be willing to take a little bit of risk to pull off some of these attacks. Now, just to highlight what these look like, this is a prominent hacker forum. And over here, one of the main items that's for sale is direct access to computer systems. So it is one of the more prominent and more prolific kind of items that's for sale on these marketplaces today. Now, what do these look like? This is an example of one. So this is from a Russian crimeware forum, and they are selling access to a government center within the US. They don't give you too many details here. It's one of these things where you have to engage them in a discussion to figure out more details about what they're selling. But you can tell this is something that's probably a pretty viable target here. Population of 80,000 in this city that they've compromised this government center of, and they're selling this for a price of around $30,000 US. So, not a bad deal if you're trying to commit espionage or you're trying to do, what have you. A lot of opportunity to be had here. Now, a lot of these groups will post multiple different organizations for sale at the same time. Talking about, here's a hospital in Saudi Arabia. Here's a government network in Connecticut. A UK insurance group, a locksmith, and they have these various price points for each of these companies. One interesting thing is a lot of these, if they are using multi-factor authentication, they will often post instructions to bypass multi-factor authentication for these organizations. So really, you have kind of an idea of what you're buying before you even begin to discuss with these people. And just to give you an idea of how prominent and successful this is a single actor, and their whole business was doing just that, is selling direct access into organizations. This is a man by the name of Andrei Turchin from Kazakhstan, who they are known as the Invisible God, or the other most prominent alias they're known as is FXMSP. And what they eventually got caught for was selling direct access into multiple antivirus organizations. They made major headlines as being the actor behind the attack against 3 prominent antivirus vendors, and they were selling the source code for all of their products and also direct access into the company. I think they were selling it from $300,000 a pop. So pretty big price point, but that I think is also what got them caught. They were most prominent for doing very simple stuff, just scanning for remote desktop protocol and doing credential sprays across the internet and opportunistically gaining access to things. And what's impressive with this is they were able to impact over 135 companies across 44 different countries. And it's estimated they made over $1.5 million during their times of activity in just a few years. So it gives you an idea of like how profitable just compromising and selling direct access into organizations can be. And I think we actually have a poll to highlight some of this as well.
Yes, there we go. So
All
I will
right.
next polling question as to what price would you guess the average network access goes for online? So any guesses?
Oh, there we go.
Okay, there you go. So I think people are going for the highest amounts.
Yeah, yeah. And it is kind of interesting, right? It's one of those things that runs the gamut. Um, it's kind of all over the place, depending on the actor, depending on the type of network they've compromised. It really runs various ranges. Um, and it's kind of a shocking thing to see because I want to say like 18 months ago, this wasn't something we saw as prominently. So yeah, I'd say that's right about in line. Like 10 grand, I would say is a pretty good even kind of range of things. But if we're looking at the high profile kind of breaches, those are definitely all kind of going to average around the 100,000 range. We've seen some that are approaching well over $500,000 easily. So yeah, it really just depends on how juicy the target is and who's willing to pay that dollar amount. All right. So to highlight some of this, let's dive into the marketplaces themselves. This is essentially going to be central trusted locations where these actors can trade and sell information. And a lot of these are hosted both on the dark net and just the general clear internet. And one interesting thing is they leverage escrow as a means of creating trust in a essentially trustless environment. Because you have, two criminals negotiating something without knowing each other, without knowing actual identities or anything. So how do you create trust? Well, these marketplaces operate escrow accounts, which basically allow you to post up, say you're going to put $10,000 in Bitcoin into this escrow to purchase access into X company. And so you post up that money, the seller verifies that you posted the money into escrow, they provide the accounts or whatever they're selling. And then once you verified that, the marketplace releases the escrow to the seller. So it kind of creates this means to create some sort of trust in an essentially trustless environment. Now, what do these look like? We were looking at some of the crimeware markets before, but there are some that are just very specialized in just selling access to nodes and selling access to credit cards and things of that nature. One of which is the Russian market. It's one of these where you can actually just go create an account. There's not really like a reputation kind of caveat to it, as there is with a lot of these groups. But over here, right now, there's just selling direct access to remote desktop protocol or for various systems on the internet. You can see what countries they're based in, the first couple octets of the IP address, details about the operating system, whether you have admin access to it, all sorts of stuff like that. But the key is these are going for pretty cheap, about $5 a pop. When we look at Linux access, these are even cheaper because these are often just going to be used as proxies to pivot through for various criminals. So over here, they're selling SSH access for under $1 per system. And it's going to vary by country, by level of access, all sorts of things like that. But really, what I find most interesting in this market is the Stealer logs. The Stealer logs are essentially exfiltrated data from web services and various infrastructures that have been compromised, where they actually contain sensitive information in the log data. And you can actually hover over some of these and see what's contained within these data sets they're selling. And like this one, they have logins and passwords, and it'll say if they have cookies, all these various types of things that could be leveraged to gain access to people's bank accounts, social media accounts, and things of that nature. Now, of course, this group also sells credit cards. As with most of these types of groups, they sell credit cards, they sell PayPal accounts, everything of that nature. And they give you kind of high level information about the credit cards here. But these are also going for relatively cheap, $20 to purchase this single credit card.
So, Greg, my researchers had found a celebrity site that was hacked, and they actually found all the credit card details of all the people who had purchased from his website, his or her website, with the credit card number, the CVV numbers, the names, the expiry dates, and all of that. So, just a little bit of a tip, if you can give our participants on how can they then secure themselves, so that, because most of them are probably not even aware that they would have visited a site, they would have put their card details, and if the site gets hacked, obviously their details are being sold in the open market in the dark web, right? So if there's a
Yeah.
tip that you could give our participants over here, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a concerning thing with shopping online in general now, because you don't know how these organizations are handling the security of the back end of these applications a lot of the times. I had a similar story of this pizza parlor that was located in my hometown here. Their website, they had multiple different locations, and they had one single website that you could access all these different locations through. And I found on accident one time, I logged in and I clicked on the wrong location. And I actually went to just check my account info, and I saw someone else's credit card and all their other information there. It was like, oh, this is really bad. And I logged out and logged into mine, and I went and checked. I saw my info. I was like, okay, this is bad. And I erased all my stuff, and I contacted them to let them know. Never heard anything back. It's still that way today. So, I mean, this is a significant problem. You have people that don't know how to build these systems securely, and they're accepting credit cards from people and handling money in all these different ways. And on top of that, you have attackers that will take advantage of these situations, not only looking at that credential exposure or the credit card exposures in that way, but say, they find a vulnerability in this website and they're able to modify the code on that website. There's a very prominent group called MageCart that's been going around doing this, where they inject JavaScript into these web forms that process credit card data, and they take that data and automatically exfiltrate it out. So anyone who's making purchases on this site is having their cards cloned. It's kind of known as e-skimming now within like the Intel circles. And so, all of these problems come to a point like, what do we do as consumers? Because we all have to shop online. It's part of what we do nowadays. So one of the things I do is I leverage privacy.com. It's a site where you can go and you can make a specific credit card for some of these one-off purchases. And you just put in the exact amount of money that you're going to pay. They give you a credit card number. You go use that on this site. After that, the credit card no longer works anymore. It's done. And if someone lifts your credit card, you'll know where they got it from, because it's the only place it's ever been used at. But also they won't be able to use it and get any other money out of your account. And it's a free service, really great service to use. Like, they don't pay me any money or anything. I just think it's a good service. So, I would definitely recommend using something like that for sure to protect our accounts, because there's not much else we can do really. We're really at the whims of these companies and hoping that they secure things appropriately.
Thank you, Greg.
No, for sure. When there's a lot of these other services, I won't spend too much time on these because we're going over, but we're a United or was the Ultimate Anonymity Services is another one. Selling direct access into computer systems, mostly personal computers across the world. Same sort of thing, same sort of makeup, though theirs go for a little higher dollar value than the Russian market. One interesting thing about UAS is they actually sell social security numbers as well. So over here, I was looking up socials for anyone who's born between 1980 and 1990 in Colorado, in Denver. So trying to find myself in this data set. Fortunately, I don't think I did. Um, but essentially, these go for just $2 a pop to get someone's social security number. And oftentimes, these are going to be fulls, or what they refer to as fulls, where they will come with more information than just the social. Oftentimes, they'll have credentials as well. So it really depends on where they were able to get this data from. But in general, I mean, social security numbers for us in the United States, I mean, they're just kind of out there already, and we just have to make peace with the fact that that information is gone and there's nothing we can do about it. It's unfortunate, but true. Now, there's a lot of these that are private markets as well. You have to get in through reputation, you have to know people, or do crimes yourself, or otherwise. So most of these markets are actually going to be closed, so making it very difficult for researchers to get into and kind of understand what they're doing. This one we found a way. We'll talk about how we got in, but essentially same sort of thing. You know, they're selling direct access to these nodes for around, you know, between $6 and $10 a pop. So relatively cheap, but it's a very common and growing industry within the dark web. Now, any good business needs good customers. And along with that, we have customers that actually even make advertisements looking for just specifically purchasing access into organizations. So this guy, Amadeus Mozart here, has made this very fancy looking ad where they're actually talking about buying RDP servers for encryption. And what's interesting too, they actually list their pricing for various parts of the world. So they have different dollar values based on where they're going to be able to target, because they know the ROI on targeting these different parts of the world. They might make more money targeting, you know, somewhere in the United States versus maybe somewhere in Africa. So either way, though, they're willing to buy all of these services that we just talked about. And this is just a single buyer. There's lots of other posts that are very similar to this that are out there. Now, at the end of the day, for them to make a profit, they have to be able to launder their money and get this money out of cryptocurrency in some fashion. Most of these groups are going to leverage Monero because it's the most prominent privacy cryptocurrency that's out there. Though there are rumors now that companies like Chainalysis are actually able to trace Monero transactions. I don't know how believable that is, but if so, I mean, that's pretty impressive, and it opens up the door for a lot of you know, previous crimes to definitely be unearthed and really tracked to completion. So that's got to be concerning for these criminals. So a lot of them we've seen move over to Haven protocol, and you know, it's just kind of this migration between privacy coins. Like Zcash was kind of the first major privacy coin. Then Dash was one that was used primarily. Monero is still, I would say, the most common one, but now we're starting to see folks use Haven coin and things like that more commonly. Now, for them to get their money out, they have to pass them through cryptocurrency tumblers. That's just basically a mixer. It's going to go throw dirty coins in that are tied directly to crimes. And then it's going to make them clean so that this guy over here can actually get his money in fiat currency. Now, the funny part about that, and the reason a lot of these groups don't do that, don't take their money out in cash, is because this is where they're going to get caught. Anytime you have to take money through an exchange, or you have to pull this money out in a Bitcoin ATM or something like that, that's going to be the avenue where you could potentially be caught. So a lot of these groups just leave their money within cryptocurrency and continue to just grow their fortunes in digital currency. So it's really an interesting kind of dynamic. But you know, to kind of summarize everything, I just wanted to highlight how easy it is for people to get in on this marketplace right now. You know, you can purchase this initial access to, say, a mid-sized corporation for around $1,000, right? And then you go and rent a ransomware as a service. You don't really need to even know what you're doing here. You just rent their infrastructure, you rent their tooling, And then you can deploy this. And these go on average for around 5 grand. Of course, there's cheaper ones, there's more expensive ones. But for about 5 grand, you can rent a ransomware as a service. And all of this, like, you don't even have to build this infrastructure, you don't have to maintain it. Like, all of this is done for you. And this allows the attackers to exfiltrate data and launch these double extortion kind of attacks. And for a company like this size, you could make probably around $50,000 from that breach. So it's definitely very lucrative and very low risk, high reward for these organizations. It just really highlights, like, they will do anything and everything to kind of profit from these types of attacks. And the way the market is evolving is making it much easier for people to get in on this and perform these types of attacks. So, like, what do we do to stop this, right? You have to have solid network segmentation and visibility across your network. Be able to see this data being exfiltrated from your environment if they've already gotten to that stage where this is possible. You want to be able to have good, solid endpoint detection and prevention. The detection components can be key in terms of understanding, what all has happened around this piece of malware. Like, how did it get there? How did they get in initially? But then you want to be able to prevent these payloads themselves so they aren't able to actually encrypt your environment and aren't able to establish these reverse connections to your systems. So there's a lot of different things that really take into account here in terms of preventing this type of access. But essentially, we want to kind of do whatever we can to create as many layers and make it as difficult and complicated for attackers to gain access to our environments as possible. Because now the playing field has made it so easy for people who might not necessarily have been in on this before to get in on this now and actually proliferate some of these attacks. And so with that, thank you very much, Feruzi. Thank you to PROTEQme and you all for joining us. Yeah.
We have a couple of questions. So apparently somebody has been hacked while gaming unexpectedly, and he wants to understand if they're able to leak his verification details in cybercrime, as in on the dark web.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Like, it depends on how you were hacked and what they got into, but anything within the system they gained access to, I would assume that they have stolen. I would just make that assumption, and with that will help kind of figure out how you can respond to this situation.
All right. There's another question where they say that even if you have secure backdoors and firewalls, are they able to infiltrate viruses through the phishing attack?
Oh yeah, that's definitely a primary way, and phishing is going to be key for getting around firewalls and those network defenses, because all of that, all they have to get back out is that reverse connection. And most firewalls are going to allow things like port 80, port 443, traditional communication means for accessing the web, the internet and various resources. So most of these attacks are going to leverage those existing standard protocols to get their shells out. So phishing is a perfect way because they subvert all of that technology, get you to run their payload, and then that payload calls out over a port that you already have open on the firewall.
Right. There's another question which says that when you get hacked, which the person has apparently gotten hacked probably, he wants to know if their real identity and credentials get leaked out and sold over and over again.
Oh yeah, and the thing too, like, a lot of what we talked about here and what is being sold and openly shared is after it's already been shared in their inner circles. So usually the data, once they're selling it and leaking it and disclosing it, is after they've already made use of it themselves and their partners have made use of it. Like Yahoo is a good example of this because they, most, I would say, largest breach in history, actually multiple breaches over like a 4-year time period. They were breached like every year. And I believe it was like 1 billion different accounts that were stolen from that. They didn't post any of this for about like a year or two after they'd already been using the data for a significant amount of time. So a lot of this won't be public for a while. It's kind of once the core e-crime groups have finalized their usage for it is when they will release it or begin to sell it outside of their inner circles.
Right. There's another question, and it says, is it secure to use a cookie without HTTP only, or secure attribute over HTTPS?
No, so the trick there is like, so HTTP only, and will essentially prevent the cookie from being stolen through cross-site scripting attacks. And you know, depending on how you have your browser configured, like some there are browser add-ons you can add, like no script, which will prevent JavaScript from running that you aren't aware of. The problem is, like, if you've ever at one point allowed a library and that a library changes, someone adds some JavaScript to it or something like that, but you've previously allowed it, they could add a cross-site scripting attack there that does steal your session token. And chances are, you know, I used to do a lot of web pen testing in the past. And what I always found was companies that would have, you know, wouldn't have the secure flag set on the token, which opens you up to sidejacking, by the way, because you could load an image over HTTP, which could transmit your cookie, and that could allow it to be sniffed or stolen or otherwise. So, you know, if they don't have that, or they don't have the HTTP only attributes set, usually that means they have various other problems throughout the application as well, which could allow a cross-site scripting vulnerability to be introduced in that application, which kind of creates or culminates in that whole attack chain being successful. Now, there's other attacks they could do with cross-site scripting as well, but going after cookies, you do need to have the HTTP only attribute not set in order to steal those tokens.
And I think we'll just take the last one, and then I think perhaps we'll write back to people who have more questions. The last one is the password files to brute force the password also come from such sites?
Oh yeah, yeah. So a lot of, like, you can buy credentials online. You can buy these password dumps. There's even various commercial services that just hook into these data leaks and use them for intelligence gathering and things like that. So, I mean, the ways to come across these credentials, the ways to find unmodifiable, personally identifiable information, such as, say, a social security number, is out there, and it's readily accessible to a lot of different people. And you know, the act of cracking passwords, a lot of times what we see within organizations specifically, say if they get onto a system, a Windows system, and they scrape the LSAS process, which basically contains your encrypted Windows domain credentials, and they're able to obtain those credentials, they don't need to crack those in order to leverage them to pivot throughout the environment. They'll use an attack called pass the hash, which essentially takes that hash credential and just leverages that as a Kerberos ticket, essentially, to migrate between systems within the organization. So, you know, if they can crack it, that's great. That makes it much easier for them, but it's not something necessary for them to gain access to their end goal. And a lot of this too, like if they do dump the full Active Directory domain, they'll take this offline and use some very powerful computers to crack that. And often that's using word lists that are obtained from various other breaches. So they have a good shot at getting, you know, on average, I'd say about 20% of those credentials right away. The other half of those credentials, maybe within a day or two, depending on the power of the system they're using. But really, I mean, if they have that data, you can assume that they will eventually get those credentials.
So somebody is urgently asking for one last question to be answered. So sorry about that, Greg. The
No
person
worries.
the person wants to understand, can black hat hacker possibly use Metasploit to hack network and other credit card numbers?
Oh yeah, yeah. Like a lot of breaches that we track are actually using things like Metasploit and various, you know, commercial penetration testing and you know, commonly accepted tooling. I would say the most common one we see now is actually Cobalt Strike. Cobalt Strike is, you know, kind of was initially built off of Metasploit, but now is kind of its own whole command and control framework, and it's awesome. It has like graphical interface. You know, you have various systems. It shows like connections of systems. So it's like a cool thing to use, but it's also very powerful and very easy to use. And it has a feature in it called malleable profiles that allows you to create and modify the way your payloads act and how they call back out. And that's specifically to avoid signature detection IDS, endpoint detection response, all of these kind of toolings that organizations will have in place. You can specifically figure out like how you can make this blend in with the organization you're targeting. We actually use it in our team to simulate adversaries. So we will try and mock, simulate the way they attack systems so that we can shore up our defenses that we're building into our products. So it's an interesting tool, right? Because like it's a good blue team tool. It's a good team tool for professional red teams to use in engagements and assess the security of their clients. But yeah, criminals use it just the same. Same with Metasploit, and all of this allows you to gain access to systems that could have that credit card information, which was being mentioned. And if they're able to gain access to that data, it's just a matter of figuring out how to get it out of the environment at that point.
Awesome. I think we've gone way over time. So I would just like to thank Greg for your time and all your awareness that you've created through this session. Of course, needless to say, thank you to all our participants who are a part of our session today and our event. What I would request everybody to do is perhaps you would like to follow Greg and PROTEQme on LinkedIn, because a lot of questions that we haven't been able to answer, we will probably collaborate with Greg and we'll come back to you with an answer. So thank you, Greg, again. Thank you all. And really pleasure. It was a pleasure having all of you all on board. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you, Firuze, and thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate your all time.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.